welcome. It's great to see everybody. I'll take a little hour here to talk about sexual trauma, from sexual trauma all the way to sexual health. And I will always tell people you're a cut above most therapists. I was telling Danielle this before we started, by coming to a training around and about sexual health. Because most therapists don't. And I'm going to talk about this in my little hour here, that we've been locked out as mental health professionals, medical professionals, of what sexual health is and what it could be, and potentially, learning expertise. And so because of that, we often lead our clients to what we think sexual health is for us, or what we've read about somewhere or learned about in our childhoods. And it may not have anything to do with the person that's sitting across from us, our client. And our whole job is to protect our clients from us. And there's no better way to do that than to get the most effective trainings to do the least amount of harm to your clients, especially around sexual health, because it's such an uncomfortable topic for so many people. So I am going to be talking. I'll make room for questions and answers. I will look at chat and see if somebody has said anything. And Danielle, I think you helped me with that, right? In case I have something. Okay. But otherwise, I just only have an hour, so I'm going to get right into it. And I'm going to kind of go into who I am just a little bit. If some of you don't know me, I've been around a long time, almost 39 years in May, actually. So I'm 61 years old. I've seen this field change in so many different ways, and I've grown and changed in so many different ways. So right now I do individual and couples therapy. I do supervision, and I do consultations. I do all kinds of things. Telehealth, obviously, where so many of us are doing now. I became an Imago relationship therapist in the 90s, and I also do workshops, although I'm not doing workshops anymore. I do intensives where couples come and do 20 hours with me. And I love to do those. In fact, the more I can do those and see less individual clients and couples clients would be something I look forward to in my later years here, because it's more productive for me to sit with a couple from Friday night and then see how they change all the way to Sunday. I'm a sex therapist. I'm accredited through American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. So I'm a certified sex therapist. I'm also a supervisor there, and I provide continuing education credits for that. And then I have my Ph.D. in clinical sexology. So I'm a master's in social work, LMSW, proudly, but then I received my Ph.D. in clinical sexology, which is where I started to change in my 40s, late 40s, moving away from the sex addiction model. I no longer work with that model. I actually believe strongly that so much of it is harmful and abusive to our clients because it doesn't have a sexual health or a sexually informed component. And it wasn't until I became sexually informed through sex therapy, sex education, that I started to realize, and in the sex therapy field, there are sex positive and sexually informed modalities to help people with compulsive sexual behavior, to help people with out of control sexual behavior. And that's important, especially with sexual trauma, because so many people, both men, women, and many people experience hypersexuality, which is often misdiagnosed, mislabeled, I should say, because sexual addiction is not a diagnosis, but it's often mislabeled as sex addiction. And it can be quite harmful and actually an error in working with your clients. So I'll be talking about that. I mean, it's just an overview today, but you'll get a lot of that. Then I also blog at Psychology Today. I love blogging there. I'd love to do more. I've just been super busy doing other things, but I've done a lot of different articles there that you could read. I've authored several books. The first 4 have been published by different publishers. The last 2 is kind of based on what we're talking about today. They're booklets. You can get all of these on Amazon.com. And these 2 books, this erotic orientation, we're going to talk about that a little bit, is for straight people. And then Cracking the Erotic Code is for gay men, and talking about the non-sexual narrative of what sexual experiences, fantasies, and turn-ons mean. And we'll talk about what all that means in here. And then I do a podcast. I love it. We're on our 4th season. It's an opportunity to not have to be a therapist and to be a guest host and then let other people talk about their their specialties. And I have a lot of therapists on there, but I also have sex workers. I have people that are sex therapists, relationship therapists. I have a lot of people. I kind of go outside the range, and researchers. So and then those that have debunked the whole idea that sex can be any kind of an addiction, and then using the sex positivity models are on there as well. And then locally in Royal Oak, Michigan, I run the Center for Relationship Health. This is an older slide. I sadly had to remove sexual health out of the name. We have a sexual health division, but so many therapists and so many reporters who would be looking for people to contact or referrals for children, that we have therapists that see children at my center. When they see sexual health, what they end up doing is thinking it's not the right place for them, that they think that's all we do. And that's what we're going to talk about today. When people hear sexual pleasure, they don't hear anything else. They just hear sexual pleasure. They forget that there's other wording in here. A long story short, I was supposed to move into another building several years ago. And when we put the signage up, we were about to move in. A female middle-aged pediatrician protested and said that the name needs to come down. Pedophiles shouldn't be allowed into the building and it would ruin her practice. And when I told her that we don't work with pedophiles, we only work with consent, we don't work with non-consent, she wouldn't budge, and the landlords removed our name from the directory, and I hired an attorney, as did they, and I did not move in there. I ended up taking up more space in my current space in Royal Oak that I was already in that became available. And so I was unwilling at the time to remove sexual health from my name, but over time, it just seemed like a good business decision. So anyways, I'm just telling you that because not all my therapists only work with sexual health. I have 17 therapists. We're actually hiring, we're growing. I'm bringing on more people. I tell people just bring your own specialty, but sexual health is something that we do here. And I think it offers something different than other places around Michigan. And then the whole idea, as I already said, the mental health and medical field has let us down by not requiring training in sex education and sexual health. And it's time for a change. And here's what I always tell therapists. If you don't keep up with sexual information and sex education, you're going to get left behind. You don't have to become a sex therapist. You don't have to get certified. But coming to something like this or going to something where you're getting some understanding, clients these days, especially the younger ones, they don't want to teach you. They want you to have some foundation so they can talk about their sexual issues. They don't want your bias. They can smell your bias a mile away. I used to say this about working with LGBT in the 90s, that if you didn't get the training and didn't get on board for working with LGBT, you were going to get left behind. And that's absolutely what's happened. And so it's going to happen here too with sex. So I love this quote. When it comes to sex, the most uncomfortable people in the room have all the power. When it comes to sex, the most uncomfortable people in the room have all the power. And so the idea here is that when somebody becomes uncomfortable, they start talking about the uncomfortable parts of human sexuality. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit and what those look like. And if you're somebody that's doing that in the room, you're not going to be helpful with your clients, especially if they have sexual trauma and they're trying to heal through that. You know, in my training many years ago in the 80s, right, we were taught, as were all the generations before me, that once sexual trauma is cleared, some people's natural sexuality and their sexual health would just simply surface. And that's just complete bullshit. I'm going to tell you right now that is so not true. Can it happen? Of course it can happen. It is not the majority of the cases. Our job is to help people locate, find, and identify what sexual health looks like for them. They need to be taught, led, educated, figuring it out for themselves. It doesn't just happen. And I think that the reason that we thought it did happen is we didn't want to talk about it. We didn't know how to talk about it. Again, being locked out of sexual health in the mental health field. And so what qualities and behaviors do mental health professionals consider in determining sexual health? These are questions I want you to think about. You know, what are you looking for when you're looking and helping your client get to a sexual health place? How do we support them in identifying their sexual needs and their aspirations? Not ours, not what we think other people's should be. What are theirs? And theirs may be completely different from yours. And actually, it may cause a lot of discomfort within you to sit with somebody with sexual desires or interests or turn-ons that don't match yours. Or you may have a disgust response, your own countertransference, which I'm hoping you're addressing as you're going through this. You know, you may think, oh, this sounds good. And I know Joe Kort, maybe you've heard of me, or I like this guy, he seems to be okay. And as the hour starts moving, you may like me less and less because you're having more and more discomfort with the material. And that's great. We want that. So then you can decide, yeah, I'm so uncomfortable, I probably don't want to work with this. Or I don't want to, I'll refer out after we get to healing somebody's sexual trauma. Or I should learn more and get some of the books that I'll be recommending or whatever. So we'll see where it helps you land. And you want to know your own personal beliefs and experiences that inform or interfere with the aspect of this part of your work. I've actually grown to believe that if you're working with a couple and you're not having the couple's conversation around the relationship, around emotional connection, and also a conversation around their sexual connection, I almost think it's unethical because every couple, whether they're active or not, whether it's okay or not, has a sex life and it should be checked in on. And even with individuals, I feel the same way. I have a friend who just became an MSW and he's been doing this a few years now. And I said, so, you know, do you talk about sexual health? He said, no, only if they bring it up. I said, you wait for them to bring it up? He said, yeah. I said, oh, so you must do that with everything. You must not talk about family of origin then until they bring it up. Oh, no, of course not. I do a genogram. I ask about their mother and father. Well, then why wouldn't you ask about sexual health too? That's part of in my opinion, the intake. That's part of their life too. And it shouldn't be any more or less problematic to ask about this in the same way we ask about suicidality, in the same way that we ask about family of origin, in my opinion. And so this whole idea of what I'm teaching you today and learning is you don't want to yuck somebody else's yum. My favorite expression in sex therapy, don't yuck just because you feel it's yucky, somebody else's yum. And I already talked about this. And most therapists often have not dealt with their own sexuality. They've not addressed their own abuse histories. They haven't addressed their own feelings around their turn-ons, their own trauma histories. And that's important to do if you're going to do this work. If you're working with sexual trauma, you should be doing that work too, so that you can, again, protect your client from you in any kind of a bias. So I'm going to teach you a few terms that, and this is I'm not going to go into this Golden Girls episode. It's a very funny one. It's the first season where Dorothy plays, B. Arthur plays Blanche. She has a best friend who happens to be a lesbian. She comes and stays at the house and she falls in love with Rose, played by Betty White. And so they're trying to tell Blanche, played by Rue McClanahan, that this friend is a lesbian. And Blanche says, well, that's okay. Isn't Danny Thomas one? And those of you that are old enough to know who Danny Thomas was, he was Lebanese. So then, of course, Dorothy says, not Lebanese, Blanche, lesbian. And so it's important that you get some terminology correct. There's so much bad. And actually, not just bad, outdated. And that's what I love about being a sex therapist is I'm learning terms that are becoming outdated and better terms to say. So, for instance, instead of saying, what did I mean by this? Porn actors and actresses. Instead of saying porn star, that's what it should say. Instead of saying porn star, you say porn actors and actresses because they are actors and actresses in porn. Talking about them being dancers. Specifically, when we talk about sex industry professionals, we usually paint them with a broad brush rather than having an understanding of that there are different ways of being. And actually, historically, we often believed that those who were in the sex industry had been trauma survivors. And we know now from all kinds of really good research, solid scientific research, clinical research, that that's not true. That there are no more or less trauma survivors than those who don't enter the sex industry. And so, especially the younger generation today who value their body, who enjoy sex, who enjoy pleasure, who want to give a good time, want to have a good time, and are entering these. And we can have a whole, and you don't have to agree with all this, by the way. Some people I'm sure are listening to this going, no, even though there's that science or whatever research, I don't agree. That's okay. We don't call them prostitutes. That's a legal term. We call them sex workers. And then this is an important thing to think about. Sex worker versus prostitute. If you mean exploitive sex work, you need to say it that way. If you mean underage sex work, you need to say it that way. If you mean migrant sex work, you need to say it that way. When you say trafficking, people don't know exactly what you mean. What happens is sometimes when I do these talks and I'm in front of people in an audience, people will raise their hand and they'll want to move away from sexual consensual, which is all I'm talking about today, consensual sex, and talk about this. And that's because they're uncomfortable. So they want to bring us all to an uncomfortable topic, which I don't allow, right? I want to bring us back to these are important conversations, but that's not what we're talking about here. In some circles, people are trying to get away from the term porn, calling it erotic television watching, sexually explicit material, erotica. I don't know if you've ever heard of cliterature, but that is a growing term. A good friend of mine, I'm going to put the name of her book because I didn't put it in here. It's called Becoming Cliterate by Lori Mintz. This has been a New York Times bestseller, and Forbes just named it one of the best 100 books that exist. Lori Mintz, Becoming Cliterate. She has a great Instagram profile too that she's very educational on. Lori Mintz, Becoming Cliterature. And cliterature would be like female porn, reading Twilight, reading Shades of Grey. That makes that women might be masturbating to different things online. And we're not going to get into this. Of course, it's an hour, and I have a lot of slides, by the way. So as I'm looking at the time, I may go through some of these slides faster than others. But we always say the problem isn't porn as sex therapists. The problem is people don't understand porn, and it is our country's, our world sometimes, sex education, except for Norway. Norway teaches sex education, and they'll use images of porn to high school students to share with them what's educational, what's helpful, what's not helpful between people for one's own self sexually. So we could talk about that's a whole other topic as well. But yes, sexual trauma can occur from watching porn at much too early of an age, right? Before you're developmentally ready to even see any images, and then you have no one to talk to about it because nobody wants to talk to you about it. Instead of saying erectile disorder, we say erectile disappointment. It's better. It's less toxic and less pathological. And I love this one. The purity culture calls it losing your virginity. Sexual debut is better. When was your sexual debut? So I had a client who they found out that their son was on OnlyFans showing off his feet and masturbating. And he was 18, 19 years old. And they said, we wanted his first time to be better, than that. And I said to them, what makes you think that was his sexual debut or first time? First time doesn't have to mean any of that. And he's being sexual, but it may not be sexual and his sexual debut for himself. And then you want to get away from saying penis and vagina. Vagina erases a woman's sexuality. It's her vulva. The vagina is in the vulva, but the vagina is not necessarily. So you see where I'm heading? I'm at least starting with giving you ideas of sexual health terms. And you'll notice I stay away from saying healthy sexuality because saying healthy sexuality implies a binary. Who decides what's unhealthy? The partner of a relationship, a minister, a rabbi, a clergy, a culture, a religion. It should really be sexual health so that gives permission for people to figure out what is health for them. And, we've moved away from it. It used to be called venereal disease, right? And then we went to sexually transmitted disease. Now we say sexually transmitted infection, STI. I talked a lot about this already, that what I want to help you do as therapists, as you're working with sexual trauma to sexual health, is to learn not to pathologize the sexual behavior, unless it's pathological, and it might be. But it's really usually the client's relationship to the behavior, not necessarily the behavior. And you want to help your client figure out what their erotic code is. You want to know what your erotic code is. You want to help them know what their partner's erotic code is. Are they having sex for procreation, recreation? Is it relational? Does it change over time? Is it all three? Is it 2 out of the 3? These are conversations to have with yourself, not with your client, obviously, about yourself. You go to supervision for that, but also with your clients for them to figure it out. 1 out of 6 boys are sexually abused. 1 out of 4 girls are sexually abused. Here's my tagline I always say, and I have a whole article on Psychology Today about this. Sexual abuse will not orient you. It will disorient you. In other words, it can't make you gay, straight, or bi, or anything in between. It can't. It can change behavior, modify behavior so that you might be engaging in homosexual behavior. You might be gay, lesbian, and engaging in heterosexual behavior. And it might be influenced by the sexual abuse, but it doesn't create an orientation. It doesn't. Now, that said, we have a sexual orientation to whom we're attracted. Then we have an erotic orientation, erotic, erotic orientation. And that's the things that turn us on, and that's the things that get us off. The things that happen to us from childhood into adulthood get embedded in our erotic orientation and do shape our turn-ons. And they're not always trauma-based. And it's not always manifesting in a kink-based. A lot of therapists think, and it's not true, that if you're kinky, you must have had some kind of trauma. That's anecdotal, and actually, in some ways, it's panecdotal, making the person believe that there's something wrong with their kinky interests, when now we have really good research, and I'll tell you where to go for this if you're interested, TASRA.org, forget what it stands for, but it's very popular in the sex therapy world. And they've done all kinds of research to show that somebody who's kinky doesn't have any more or any less trauma than do people who are not kinky. Anyways, so that's something to consider. And then abuse versus trauma. Most therapists, sadly, have merged the two, that if you're talking about abuse, then you must be traumatized. And we know that's not necessarily true. Some people are abused and don't experience any trauma. Some people are abused and do experience trauma, but it might be delayed into later in life. So I used to historically impose on people that, of course, you were traumatized. If a 40-year-old came in and had anal sex with you when you were 10, that's trauma. And I don't know if you've ever had clients like this. I've had so many, because it's my specialty, is say to me, I actually enjoyed it and it turned me on. And as a result of that, now I'm telling you, there are adults telling me this. I'm not working with kids telling me this. It's of course abuse. And I still hold strongly to my clients that that's abuse. But if they say to me, that was my sexual debut, if I say to them, it can't be your sexual debut, you were 10, they were 40, it's abuse, and there was trauma and all this stuff, they'll fire me. And I've had clients say to me, if you don't let me have this and understand that for me, and it's not just gay clients, I've had straight clients, I've had men, I've had women, and I've had to understand that for that person in my room, for that experience, it was not trauma. Maybe later in life they'll find out it is, but maybe they won't. Because we have a lot of research, as I said, that it's not always trauma. We're not going to get into each of these, and I'm happy to share these slides, and we're going to have this whole hour on tape, so you'll be able to watch it again if you want. But we know what overt sexual abuse looks like. And maybe people, it's not like they don't remember it happened, but maybe they haven't connected to how it affected their lives today. But once they do, the therapy starts to move. Overt sexual abuse is so much harder. These are things that are like invisible people in the room that you can't see, and you're going over it and over, and it takes longer for people to move through the hidden things that happen to them as children. And then the consequences of sexual abuse as children is, like I said, sexual disorientation, sexual compulsions, erotic sexual interest developed from them, but not only from sexual abuse, it can come from anywhere, and sexual dysfunctions. Let me give you an example of how something can come from your childhood that isn't about sexual abuse. I worked with a guy who had a fetish for women who were amputees. They had to be missing one or two legs. And he didn't need to go to porn to watch to get off. He liked going to YouTube, watching women who were disabled and were missing a leg. And this turned him on, and this bothered him as the Me Too movement grew, because he didn't want to fetishize these women, and he felt like he was, and objectifying them. And I actually am shocked when I'm about to tell you this, that so many therapists don't do genograms. I don't mean formal genograms, but for me, I'm in the dark if I'm working with a client, and by the fourth session, I haven't known who mom is, and what are her positive and negative traits, and how did she impact you? How did dad or fathering figure impact you? How did grandma? How did your siblings? That helps me understand what shaped your worldview and how you move through the world. But so many therapists don't do this anymore, and they hardly teach it in school. It's kind of shocking to me. Anyway, so I do this with this client, and what happened is when he was a little boy, he had a fully able-bodied mother who was so depressed she couldn't get off the couch. And so across the hall in their apartment complex was a woman who had an amputated leg, and she would go up and down the stairs, and she would bring groceries up, and he would offer to help her, and she'd say, "No, I don't need your help, but I need your company. You can join me." So he would. So when his erotic or sexual orientation kicked in, it was to females. When his erotic orientation, the things that turned him on, they were to female amputees. Because in our fantasies, it rights the wrong. It goes from trauma to triumph. In other words, that might have been very traumatic or hard or negatively impact having a mom on the couch and they're on medical assistance because she can't even work. But here's this empowered woman across the hall. And we'll talk about that as we get to the end of my talk. But that's really how you help somebody in who's had some sexual trauma. It's one of the ways that I work a lot with in interpreting sexual fantasies. Sexual dysfunction can result from a childhood sexual abuse. Some people can lose sexual interest and they will misidentify themselves as anorexic. I'm not anorexic, I'm sorry, asexual. They'll say, you know, I'm an asexual, and asexuality is real. Somebody that doesn't have interest in being sexual with others or even themselves. But they might not be asexuals. They may prefer that label, and it could be a result of CSA. Performance anxiety for men and women, men having difficulty getting or maintaining an erection, women having an inability to become wet and having or become swollen and engorged so that she can be turned on. And then many people can have difficulty reaching orgasm as a result of childhood sexual abuse. And when I use the term trauma, I like Mary Jo Barrett's definition. It's defined as having something emotionally charged happen to you, but not being able to express it. Pervasive mindset that develops from historical and often ongoing relationships of violation, abuse, and neglect. If you haven't read Mary Jo's stuff, I highly recommend it. In the 80s, when I was getting an internship at Catholic Social Services in Livonia, she came in. She's older than me. She's 10 years more than the field, I think. And she has a great line. She said, she's been around a long time. Trauma work is like good comedy. Timing is everything. Timing is everything. And I think that's a great line. I tell my clients that all the time. You don't want to push somebody through sexual trauma. You don't want to rush sexual health even to a client. Even though when I first became a sex therapist, I did that because I was so excited that, oh, wow. And in fact, I didn't tell you this, I'm a sexual abuse survivor. And as a gay man who also experienced sexual abuse, I had all kinds of sexual confusion and issues, and things were problematic. So I went to a therapist who helped me unpack all of this and wasn't afraid to talk to me and really worked with my timeline and didn't rush me through what I needed to do. But we understand that when somebody does experience trauma, they can experience trauma reenactment. What people don't understand, a lot of therapists don't understand, is that you can move to trauma play. And I'm going to talk about what this means in a minute. That what happens to you in childhood becomes an imprint. And then as an adult, you return to the scene of the crime and you reenact that trauma as an adult with another adult. So this is a very dense, thick book, but it's a great concept that I like to bounce off of, which is these kids were, and some teachers on the bus were kidnapped by some men who had dug a hole and taken the bus, threw everybody into the hole, put a cover on it, and held them for ransom to get money. This was in the 1976. And basically, when they were rescued, and the way they were rescued is the kids, the smaller kids were on the shoulders of the older adults and the bigger kids and the bigger adults. When they were doing play therapy by the therapists who were helping them, they were reenacting the kidnapping on the bus. A kid would play bus driver, another kid would play victim, another one would be a hijacker. And we know when you're working with kids, this is how you can intervene. Kids reenact their trauma, reenact their abuse so that you can intervene. So do we as an adult, especially in the sexual realm is where I'm talking. We replay, we're like those kids in our sex play. And when you understand what people are doing sexually and erotically, you'll discover how to intervene and you'll discover the non-sexual narrative. So it's a tendency, trauma reenactment is a tendency of the unconscious mind to tell its story by forcing the person to repeatedly and compulsively act out their abuse as an erotic fantasy. Trauma play is this. So trauma reenactment is I break my relationship agreement, I'm compulsively acting out the behavior, and I'm putting myself at risk, legal, medical, or otherwise. Trauma play is I still do the exact same behavior I always did, only now I'm negotiating this with my partner. I'm not compulsive. It doesn't control me, I control it. And I'm not putting myself at risk of medical, legal, or any kind of consequence. But most therapists think if you're still fantasizing, wanting, desiring the thing that was in your abuse or in your trauma, then you haven't healed. And the research doesn't show that anymore. And you've got a client for life because there's no such thing as giving a client an erotic ectomy. There's no such thing as an erotic ectomy. Clients will come in and say, I don't want to think about the same way. It's what my uncle did to me. It's what my mother did to me. It's what my grandmother, whatever. And it makes sense. And people aren't hostage to having that fantasy for their life. It might be that it's always there, but they don't have to act on it. They can lower the volume. They can add to their erotic repertoire, but it's not about getting rid of it. It's unlikely, since it's from an imprint in your life, hard to get rid of. And, you know, I love Van der Kolk's work, if you read Bessel's stuff, and he says basically, if you don't pay attention to the contribution of how past abuse and trauma contribute to the current problem and how someone's organized their life, in our case here, how they've organized their sex life from the sexual trauma, you won't be able to intervene and help them. And if you get distracted by the behavior, I always say, if you are anti-porn, let's say as a therapist, and a couple comes in and one is anti-porn and doesn't like that their partner likes watching porn, and you jump in and you side with the one that doesn't like porn, you're no longer helping them as a couple. You can give their money back, their insurance back, and go to coffee with them and have that conversation. It isn't about the porn. It's about the couple negotiating and figuring out what it brings up for them and it's a differentiation moment. Most therapists are fine helping couples differentiate unless it's sexual. And if somebody says, no, I don't want to do this, and somebody says, yes, but I do want to do this, usually, and I've been this therapist too, we align with the one who said no. No is no. Absolutely. The no shouldn't have to turn into a yes, but there's still a yes in the room. And Ellen, I hope I say her name right. I get a little nervous when I do these talks. Ellen Bader, she's a marriage therapist. She says, when you forbid your partner, you invite secrecy. When you would forbid your partner, you invite secrecy. So in other words, the yes is still in the room. So the no doesn't have to change to a yes. But what does the yes do? The yes, if you make the yes go away with their and go underground, now you've got a secretive partner. They're still going to want to do it. So what are the ways that it can still occur in the relationship with the no still being able to say no? So maybe this partner is going to watch erotica. Maybe they're going to have an open relationship. Maybe they're going to talk about it in sex, but the no isn't going to do what they're talking about. There's so many different options here that a lot of therapists don't think about. I talked about this already. I talked about asexuality being real. But you want to, when someone comes in, make sure that it isn't, and that's our job, right? Our craft is, can we help our clients see if it might be related to early trauma or not? Because it may or it may not. It is a legitimate sexual orientation, though. I talked about sex addiction. I don't want to get into a lot of it here, but I will tell you that the entire modality is not sexually informed. I learned a lot about trauma. I learned a lot about addiction. I knew nothing about sex. And to me, when you're working with clients, that's so unfair that you should be sexually informed, as should the clients, so that they can make a above board consensual decision about what they want to do. And what I didn't like about the sex addiction model is they would say, if you're compulsive in any kind of behavior, then you can no longer do that behavior because the behavior got you in trouble. Well, that's not a sexually informed thing to say. And plus, now you're moving that client away from what they enjoy. Yes, it became compulsive, but there's ways to make it not compulsive. But if you're saying, no, you can't do this anymore, then you're moving that, you're trying to give them an erotic ectomy, basically, which is, as I just said, not a real thing. One of the sex positive models we use in sex therapy and this is helpful for working with sexual abuse survivors who engage in hypersexuality, People, they have 6 principles. They say don't focus on the behaviors, focus on the relationship to the behaviors based on principles. And that most therapists engage in what they call a premature evaluation. Someone comes in and says, I'm a sex addict. And then they're like, okay, then let's get you to in the 12-step program. Let's get you to, read the sex addiction books, rather than looking at the many, many, many reasons somebody may be experiencing and exhibiting hypersexuality. So these are the principles they talk about. Is your sexual behavior consensual on both sides, non-exploitive, using protection against pregnancy and having safer sex? Is it honest between you and your partners? Does it have shared values between the two of you? And is it mutually pleasurable? They believe, and if you read their book, they talk it through, that if the more aligned you are with these principles, the less likely you'll engage in problematic behavior, sexual behavior. And then Jack Moran, he's written a great book. I highly recommend The Erotic Mind, because that's kind of where we're going to head for the last part of this. Because he talks about the non-sexual meanings of your sexual narratives. And he says, if you go to war with your sexuality, you will lose and cause more chaos and more trouble than before you started. So you don't want to go to war with your sexuality. You don't want to have your client gripping around their sexuality. I'm not going to do that. I'll come back to that if I can. I'm just looking at the time. So you want to find out what turns your client on sexually. You have to be comfortable asking all kinds of questions. The details are super important, because what you're going to find is that embedded in their sexual, because they're trauma survivors, it's likely, just like anyone, that the things that happen to them are going to get embedded in their erotic interest. So trauma is turned into pleasure, or triumph, as we talked about the name of this. Victim is turned into victor. Our minds unconsciously infer that if everyone is aroused in the sexual fantasy and act, nobody's really sad or hurt. In our fantasies, everybody's having a good time. So even if somebody's imagining and getting off and turned on by something that happened to them that was horrible, or something that happened to someone else that was horrible, in the fantasy, it's not horrible because everybody's turned on by it. That's what fantasies are for, to anesthetize and to help people work through, sort of like the play therapy. When we are fantasizing, when we are engaging in fantasies, when we're role playing, when we're being sexual with others, it's like children with play therapy. And our eroticism has its own intelligence. Embedded in sexual fantasies and desires are a person's core identity. Fantasies reveal so many things. So I'm going to think about, I'll give you this example. I had a guy I worked with, and I work a lot with men and couples. People always think because I'm gay, I work with only gay people. In Detroit, I could have never made a living on just gay people. There's not enough. So I primarily see straight people. 75% of my practice is straight. In fact, somebody will call and say, do you see straight people? And I say to them, it's one there. It's one there. Like I'm that kid in the Sixth Sense, right? Of course I see straight people. I didn't land here from some gay planet and then, infiltrate yours and learn your habitat. I've been around you forever. Anyways. So I worked with this guy, and he was heterosexual. He was married, loved his wife. They had a great sex life until she opened the door and caught him masturbating with other men on cam. And they were from the head down. They were headless men, as he was too. So they both came in. They thought he might be gay, bi, at least not straight. What is it? I don't, and this is another talk to do, and I'll embed it in all of the things I'm going to do for NASW as well. But I talk about how you can be straight and still have sex with the same sex, whether you're a man or a woman. And so in this case, this man had a sexual abuse history where when he was 10, he had an older brother and male cousin. They were in their later teens, who coerced him into giving them oral sex. But before he could, they pushed him to the floor and they called him a faggot and told them to leave him alone. And then he hardly had any relationship with them after that. And this traumatized him. He never told a soul. But the soul wants to talk. The unresolved wants to resolve. And so now it's gotten embedded in a sexual fantasy. So when I asked him, what do the men look like that you're on cam with? How do you feel toward them? How do they feel toward you? What's the scenario? Is it role play? Are you giving them oral sex and they're sitting back enjoying it? Are they thrusting down your throat? Is it a power exchange? Do you imagine you've paid them? I have a million questions that are transferential, because it's in the transference between that person and the fantasy they're having or the person they're involved in that then tells me about their history, leads me to their history. Now, remember, I've already done a genogram. So now I'm asking questions about the sexual, and I'm thinking about the genogram. And he said, these men are headless. There is no man other than I'm giving him oral sex. And I'm compulsive about it. I'm repetitive about it. And I was doing it secretly from my wife. And he actually met a few of these men. So he put himself at risk for other things as well. And so I said to him, do you think it has anything to do with this past where you had this situation with your older brother and your older cousin, and they wanted you to give them oral sex? And I'm talking this through, and he starts crying. He has a meltdown across from me. He remembered that, of course, but he never connected it. So now the work begins. That informs the therapy work of your abuse survivor clients. So now we put them in a men's group. I send them to a men's weekend workshop. I'm an EMDR therapist. We do EMDR. We do couples therapy. He does individual therapy. 2 years later, he still has the fantasy. He still has the desire to get on cam with men, but it's not compulsive any longer. He has a negotiated agreement with his wife, and he's not putting himself at risk by meeting any of these men anymore. So he goes from trauma reenactment to trauma play. And many therapists would say that's not good enough. It may not be good enough for you, but it might be good enough, and often is good enough for the client, because trying to change an already existing strong childhood impactful fantasy and occurrence can take a lifetime, if at all. And then Jack Moran talks about, listening to people's fantasies, but not just one peak erotic fantasy. You ask your clients about that, but you also want to find out what is the core erotic theme. That's what he calls these core erotic themes. Just you're interpreting it like a dream. That's basically what you're doing. I talked about a lot of this already, and I love this quote from Esther Perel. I think she's right on the money. Tell me how you were loved as a child, and I will tell you how you make love as an adult. I agree 100%. And really, this is true from an Imago perspective. Tell me how you were loved as a child, and I'll tell you how you love as an adult. We return to the scene of the crime by picking people that resemble the people that raised us. We return to the scene of the sexual crime in our sexual, but sometimes things aren't crimes, right? Sometimes one's first exposure to a nude body might be somebody who has not trimmed their pubic hair, right? And so if that's your first and an erotic interest that you had as a young person, and you start masturbating to that, well, that may be that you like now porn or people who don't trim around their genitalia, that you like hairy bush, they would call it, right? But that's not from any kind of trauma. That's just an imprint of something that happened to you or that you witnessed as a young person. And then Michael Bader's book, The Secret Logic of Sexual Fantasy, he's written a book on male sexuality as well. Same idea, that his theoretical and clinical approach is that fantasies are a result from an unconscious attempt to solve problems, not recreate them. To solve them, not recreate them. I've said a lot of this already, but I almost feel like I'm trying to reinforce it so people understand it from different points of view. These are his two books, Michael Bader's books. So I do a genogram. I ask about sexual fantasies and desires. I help interpret the fantasies with the client. There is no cookbook to this, by the way. I mean, as a therapist, you know this. Many of you have been in the field a long time yourselves. You think you have a brilliant connection for your client. You're like, I'm going to say this to them, and I've thought about this case, and they're going to be mind blown. And you say it, and they look at you, and they go, nah, not really. The next time it's a long day, they're your last client, you just say something off the cuff. You think, well, maybe your mother meant this. And they're like, oh my God, you changed my life. And you had no intention of doing that. You're tired. You were just thinking of a theory. So you never know what's going to land on a client. I don't pretend to know. I don't pretend. What I do say is give them everything you got. Tell them all of the theories that could be connections, and they'll know. It'll land for them, not you, for them. These are some of the questions that you can review. These are just a few of the questions I ask. Again, they're transferential in helping somebody understand what may or may not be related to their abuse. So the idea is abuse happens. So I had a guy who was sexually abused in the bathtub by his grandfather when he remembers it because he said to his grandfather, "You're watching me longer than my mommy does." He was that young, and the grandfather stopped right away, and he never saw the grandfather again. And it wasn't talked about, but later he discovered he was sexually abused. His sexual behaviors that were causing him trouble and problems and putting him at legal risk were that he was going into rest areas, getting other men to masturbate him. He was again returning to the scene of the sexual crime with his grandfather. I talked about that already. I talked about that already. I talked about that already. Some people have rape fantasies, which they're calling ravishing fantasies now, right? A lot of abuse. And again, it doesn't have to always come from abuse, but this is about sexual trauma to sexual triumph. Sometimes being in a non-consensual situation, which sexual abuse always is non-consensual when you're a child, the other person is older or an adult, it may be eroticized. So a non-consensual fantasy may turn you on because it's, again, anesthetizing the pain, righting the wrong that happened to you as a child. Some people, we can talk about this in other, when I do longer seminars with you, and I do anyways, that watching porn in and of itself is not problematic. People have pathologized porn, and what they don't understand is for many people, it's not the porn, it's the self-pleasuring. It's getting used to your own timing, when you're going to stop, when you're going to start, your own orgasm. You don't have to negotiate with another person. It never says no. It never has a headache. It's always available in the same way as sex toys are for women. Sex toys, if you get into a fight with your clients about what good porn, bad porn, or good sex toys, bad sex toys, you're really not helping the client because it's not about the sex toy. It's about what the sex toy is. Because a lot of people will say that aren't abused and don't have problematic sexual behavior. I watch porn because I can get off and I don't have to, get clean and be with my partner. A woman might say, I use a sex toy because it's just easier. I don't have to negotiate with my partner. I don't have to wait for him to come home. So there's healthy components to this. And then, of course, there can be compulsive, problematic components to it. And it can be a way of avoiding a relationship. But it's not the sex toy's fault, and it's not the porn's fault. It's the avoidance. And the sex toy and the porn are being used to avoid. And then cross-dressing, I'm not going to get into each one because of time, and I see that there are some questions. But I've had some men where they have been treated like little girls by their parents or an older sibling. And so that gets eroticized. They didn't like it as a kid, but it becomes something that, I'm not talking about trans. Cross-dressing has nothing to do with trans. Cross-dressing is usually a straight man's erotic turn-on by feeling like a woman, not actually being a woman. The more he feels like a woman, the more eroticized. So that can also come from, I've had people who have had small penis humiliation fantasies where they like to be teased or made fun of. So that could be from just growing up with a smaller penis, thinking they had a smaller penis, or being told that their penis was too small and having all kinds of negative feedback from partners, from other bullies, people in their lives, being laughed at. I had a guy who would go to massage parlors, but it was because he always imagined that he was somebody's favorite. He was never his mother's favorite. He never felt favored by his wife after they had kids. He felt that she favored the kids. So he couldn't negotiate how to reconcile any of that. So what he did before he came to therapy was massage parlors were the way that he learned to negotiate it. He'd walk in, he was a good looking guy, and he could see that the women were fighting over him because they wanted to be around him. And some people get external validation from their sexual, so they got it as a little child. For some people, the abuse is horrible, but the attention feels loving. So as an adult, now they've sexualized that attention, and one of the ways is getting external validation. For some people, money, being bribed. Kids are being bribed. I'll buy you this. I'll gift you this. I'll give you money so you can help your family. And then money becomes sexualized for some of these people. I'm not going to get into, there's so many more here. You can read this later. I'm going to read, if I could, I'll just read some of these. I have so many slides. We have 10 minutes left and I see so many questions. I'm going to go back. Let me see what people wrote. I'm curious, what do you think of the difference, Madeline is asking me, between trauma reenactment and the development of kink? So yeah, I think there's no more or less trauma in kink, and the research shows this, than somebody who's not traumatized or abused in any way in kink? Is it a sort of necessary, sufficient distinction? That's, I would say, I would move away from um, thinking that it comes from somewhere bad. And a lot of therapists think this even about teenagers. Like a lot of therapists will say, well, your first fantasies or the first kinds of things you think is something you develop. It's not something that's natural for you. That's not true. That's not true. You can be kinky from the start, and that is your sexual orientation. That is your erotic orientation. It's not something we think it's something that is developed because you've already decided and we've already thought the bias is we're all naturally going to have PIV sex, penis and vagina sex. We're all naturally going to want to have intercourse, even gay men, a PIA, penis and anus sex. But that's not necessarily true. A lot of people don't want that. And a lot of people in the kink community don't have that. Yeah, it's all about agency. Love that, Sarah. Love, love, love that. What else we got here? Do you have any thoughts about how these dynamics can play out within the therapeutic relationship? Yes, erotic transference. I used to talk so much more about that, but you know, I love to talk about it, and I love it when it happens because, you know, you're helping your client hold on to their erotic life with a boundary that, of course, we're not going to engage in any of that. But I've gotten more and more nervous about this as time's gone on because I don't know if you know this, but I know this as a sex therapist around other researchers and other sex therapists that are on boards of different licensing bodies. The top reason therapists are getting targeted and what's the word, written up or reported is because they feel the therapist has come onto them. And how did they think the therapist came onto them? The therapist might have said, no, you're really a good looking guy. You're going to meet a lot of women. You're a good looking woman. And let me show you, let's talk about Tinder and how you can make your pictures better. I don't say any of that anymore. I don't hug my clients anymore. I barely touch them anymore. I hardly say anything, even if I think that, and I mean it in a therapeutic way, because we're living in a culture where things get misinterpreted way too far. So erotic transference is really important, and I can do a whole thing on that, but I really do stay away from that. Can you talk about guilt, confusion, and the sexual abuse survivors? Can you talk about guilt, confusion, and sexual abuse survivors related to how their bodies responded? Yeah, you know, I help people see that you can't help that even when people are sexually tortured, their bodies will respond by getting an erection, being turned on, because their body doesn't know they're being tortured. Their mind knows they're being tortured. And sometimes pain is pleasure for some people. And while you're experiencing pain during abuse, you might have experienced pleasure, but the pleasure doesn't mean you liked nor wanted the abuse. Even if you did look for it. I have clients that say, well, I look forward to the next time. Yeah, because you came from a neglectful family. It was the only attention that you got. Yeah, you came from an abusive family. It was what you thought in your head was loving attention, but it doesn't mean you loved the abuse. And then, like I said earlier, some people said, I did love the abuse. It wasn't abuse to me. It was love. And I will challenge that. But after a while, if they say, listen, if you keep challenging that, I'm going to find another therapist, I stop and say, that's your reality then. And I bow to that. I do say to them, if later in life it comes back, at least you remember I said it. If it doesn't come back, you were right, and that's fine. Oh, that was the last question. I don't know. Did I answer? I hope I answered your questions there. I talked really fast. I only had an hour. What are other thoughts or questions? We have 5 minutes, right, Danielle? Or do we have to?
Yes, and if folks would rather unmute than type it in, feel free to, you can unmute or raise your hand.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie. It was a great overview. The stuff is extremely complicated. It is very nuanced. This is all screwed up. I didn't do the slide right. This should say at Dr. Joe Kort everywhere. You know, you can sign up anywhere for me here on TikTok. I just hit 675,000 followers. I'm like a TikTok star. And I love doing TikTok because I love being able to be out in the public eye and helping them understand these things as much as I can say them on TikTok. But I want us as therapists to be informed. I want our clients to come in and not have to worry that because you don't think it's a good idea for them, that you're going to make it not a good idea for them. That's not fair. It's not fair. What's fair is for.
Sorry, I was just saying, I work with a lot of trans teens, and just exploring sexuality with them is it's like they have their sex ed at school is completely worthless. And their relationship to their bodies is so complicated that it's like it really helps to to have these kinds of venues to talk about this stuff, because it's like we have to be knowledgeable because nobody else in their lives are.
Right. Thank you. It's true. And here, listen, there are some things I listen to and I'm like, okay, yeah, I don't want to work with that. And we have the right to say that. I had one guy that was into what's in the gay community called twinks. Twinks are 18 years old and higher and older, and they're very thin and lean, and they can be any race, but they're usually boyish looking. And I had a guy say to me once, I love twinks. And sometimes I hope that they tell me that they're a twink and that they're 18 and older, but they're really not. In my fantasy, I'm kind of, because there are young, this is why I don't work with teens anymore. Young teens get on Grindr, get on these things and pretend to be twinks. And once he told me that, I that's out of my wheelhouse. I don't want to work with it, only because I don't like it, but I also I don't have the training. So I have Matthew Rosenberg here locally that I refer to, and I referred him to him just to see, is he somebody that really would act on it, or is he somebody that would just likes the fantasy of it? Because there is a difference, and that's a whole talk in and of itself. But all I guess I'm saying is, if you don't want to work with something, don't, because your client will know. But it is, sex is complicated, it's nuanced, whether it's from trauma, whether it's just from, I mean, if we went around the room, we won't today, right? I mean, how many people are here? I used to do workshops like this. It's 122 people. It's too many people, right? But I used to do workshops for men, and we would go around and do genograms, and we would create a safe space. Then we'd go around and we would talk about fantasies and help people understand. And the reason I like this, let me just say this at the end, is that it invites erotic compassion. It invites erotic empathy. You want your client to have erotic empathy for themselves. You want their partners to have erotic compassion for their partner and for themselves. That's the whole goal. That's my entire goal in the remainder of my years as a therapist, is to bring that out for anybody I can do it for.